Morning, everyone. Happy or afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Tuesday. It is the 6th of February and 1:15 p.m. Before we jump into education spending conversations, just want a public service announcement. On the agenda for S18, there's an amendment on the agenda. It is a technical amendment that was requested by the Department of Liquor and Lottery that the GovOps committee is going to look at first informally, and then we will hear about it so that we can amend the bill if and when we pass it. But there were some people getting excited about a possible amendment. Just want to sort of public service announcement, not so exciting. And then turning to education finance and welcoming the education committee. When we were last all gathered here together, we all essentially established that the mechanism that we are using to protect taxpayers in districts who lost tax capacity with the implementation of the pupil weighting bill, that 5% cap mechanism is clearly not working. I think that's what we all sort of agreed on last week. And so in the intervening time, I've worked with a number of people, including our joint fiscal office and tax department and Nicole at AOE, to say what is a transition mechanism that might work better, that would still protect taxpayers, but would restore that linear relationship in the education fund so that we can make further changes in the future. So the first question that we had to answer for that is essentially like, how do we even determine impact? Like, how do we essentially measure someone's loss in tax capacity in a meaningful way? And so that's the first piece that I'm going to ask Julia to take us through as she explains some of the pieces that I asked her to model for us. Julia, would you like to join us? Thanks. And so what we're going to do today, basically, is we're going to, Julia's going to take us through the mechanism that I asked her to model. And then we are going to ideally look at some legislative language from Kirby that matches up with that math. And then if we still have time, we'll hear from Nicole about what that would actually look like at, that's the game plan for the afternoon. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. Just joining the Zoom now. Madam Chair, would you like me to do the presentation on my screen?
Yes, please, if that works for you.
Sure.
Try to rest. Oh, good.
Great. So as the chair spoke about, I was asked to put together some slides referencing the modeling that we were asked to conduct in preparation of today's testimony. So basically, I'll be talking in sort of two broad buckets today. First, talking about analyzing changes in tax capacity from FY 2024 to FY 2025 and what that looks like, how that math works, with some examples, and then at the state level, and then walk through an illustrative example of the transition mechanism that the chair referenced. To level set, I know this is familiar, but it's helpful to keep, certain concepts in the forefront when thinking through all of these things. So thinking big picture about the Ed Fund. So that Vermont's education funding formula distributes money to schools using the statewide education fund, and that school districts' homestead property tax rates are adjusted by their local ed spending per pupil. That ed spending per pupil is calculated by dividing districts' ed spending by its long-term weighted average daily membership, which we'll be referring to throughout the presentation as LTWADM. I don't know if that saves syllables, but it certainly saves characters on the slides. So as we know, with the new pupil weights with Act 127, some school districts will see an increase in tax capacity, while others will see a decrease in tax capacity. We'll recall that tax capacity refers to the total funding that a school district draws from the ed fund for a certain tax rate, right? So the tax rates vary based on that ed spending per pupil, and tax capacity refers to the corresponding tax rate. And feel free, please, to interrupt with questions as I'm going through. So thinking first about the share of the state's long-term weighted average daily membership from FY24 to FY25. We'll know that we're currently in FY24, and all of the deliberations about the ed fund are for FY25. So how do we think about analyzing changes in tax capacity across districts? So one way to do that is to analyze the change in a district's share of the statewide long-term weighted average daily membership across years. So if a district experiences or sees an increase in its share of the statewide weighted pupils, then it will see an increase in its tax capacity. The converse is also true. If it experiences a decrease in its share of the statewide weighted pupils, it will see a decrease in its tax capacity.
This is off topic, but just very grateful for all the folks from Snelling Center who are joining us today. It is perfectly polite to leave in the middle of testimony. No one will be even slightly offended. You're also welcome to stay the whole time, but just don't feel like you're stuck in your seats because you sat down.
Yes.
So this is absolutely enthralling.
So I put together an example to show, before thinking about the state, because those are big numbers, lots going on, put together an example to think about just comparing and calculating changes in tax capacity in this artificial world in which Vermont has only 3 school districts, which are districts A, B, and C. So how do we go about analyzing that change in tax capacity in these 3 totally made up districts? First, we'll calculate the district's share of statewide weighted pupils in FY24, then the district's share in FY25, and then we'll calculate the relative change between those 2 fiscal years. So step 1, we've got these 3 example districts. We're going to assume that Vermont has 100 weighted pupils that are split across these 3 example districts. District A has 50 long-term weighted ADM, District B has 15, and District C has 35. So next we see what is the share that each one of those districts has in terms of the state's total statewide long-term weighted ADM. So in this example, we see that District A has 50% of the state's long-term weighted ADM. District B has 20% and District C has 30%. So while they have different counts of weighted pupils, we can also see the corresponding share of the state. Then moving forward into FY25, let's assume that there's been a policy shift, such as Act 127, potentially demographic shifts as well. And so now we have a statewide total long-term weighted ADM of 200. So moving up. And when going through the calculation process, which AOE does annually, we have that the long-term weighted ADM across these 3 example districts has changed now, right? So District A has 100, District B has 50, and District C has 50. So there's a total of 200. those statewide totals are different, so we can't compare apples to apples just in terms of the actual number of change of pupils because everyone is seeing an increase. So we look at the statewide share. We see that District A has a state share of 50%. District B and District C both now have a state share of 25% of the long-term weighted ADM. So with that change, we can now start to think about comparing those shares to see how tax capacity has shifted. So we spoke about this while the number of the statewide long-term weighted ADM increased from FY 24 to 25, that increase wasn't uniform across all 3 districts. So we see that some districts saw an increase in their tax capacity, or one district saw an increase in its tax capacity, one district saw a decrease, and one district stayed the same. So that's just really what those pie charts are showing. By district, what share of the state long-term weighted ADM is that district holding? That corresponds with its tax rate. So the final step here is to calculate the relative change between these districts. So to determine the difference, we calculate the relative change of state share, and that way we can get more of an apples to apples comparison. So that's what we're doing here. We're calculating the FY 24 share and the FY 25 share. What is the relative change for each district? So we can see that District A saw 0% relative change. District B saw a 25% relative increase, and District C saw a relative decrease of about 17%. So that's one way to get at analyzing changes in tax capacity within a statewide fund where you've got districts of different sizes with different pupil weights from one year to the next year. I think I spoke about all of this already, but really the takeaways here are that every district saw an increase in its long-term weighted ADM in this example, but not every district saw an increase in its tax capacity. The change in tax capacity depends on how a district's long-term weighted ADM increased or decreased compared to all of the other districts in the statewide fund, not just that district's change. And so by comparing the change in state share, tax capacity changes can be compared and analyzed across districts, sort of an apples to apples comparison. So I'll pause there. Are there questions about that structure?
Great, go forth.
Okay.
Peter has permission to interrupt because I can't see anything happening. Thank you.
Okay. So now taking that structure, that hypothetical world that we were in, where there were 3 districts and 100 or 200 weighted pupils, and saying, what does it actually look like in Vermont if we were to apply this methodology to Vermont? So if we're comparing a district's state share of long-term weighted ADM from FY 24 to FY 25, we're capturing a couple of different things. We're capturing changes to tax capacity based on the implementation of Act 127. We've got the new pupil weights coming in. We also will be picking up any demographic shifts within the state and within districts. So this is how that analysis looks. If you're looking at the relative change, so the same math here, but applying it to every district across the state. So interpreting this graph, what we're seeing here is each one of these dots is a district in the state. Side note, there's 3 unorganized town and gores that are not included here because they have a special provision with respect to rates. So we're simplifying it down so we can do an apples to apples comparison here. That's why there's 120, not 122. So each dot references a district On the left side, we see the largest decrease in tax capacity, which corresponds with the percentages that we're seeing here on the left. So that's that change in the relative change in state share. Also true on the right, we're seeing the districts that are seeing the largest relative change in the share of statewide long-term weighted ADM.
Julia, for the FY 25 long-term weighted ADM, are those the numbers that were sent to the districts by AOE that we were told by Nicole have been locked down?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Is there like a document that you could easily share that says which of these districts is which? Because I have been getting a ton of questions about that I don't totally know how to answer.
We will get there.
Thank you.
It's not in the slide deck here, but it is possible to calculate.
Thank you.
Sure.
Sure, Representative Massey.
Yeah, I don't think we saw this last week, but there's some of us from our various districts like to know where our towns stand within this assortment, shall we say, both in terms of spending, taxing capacity. I mean, the essential stuff that you're presenting, it would be helpful to many of us if we could see where our towns fit in this.
Yes, and that,
I'm gonna sort of add a caveat. So I asked Julia in presenting this information, if we could all totally get our heads around the concepts and the fairness of the concept before everyone starts diving into their feelings about each individual district and their vibe about whether a district deserves something or not, and
And I
all of
was
that.
on
My needs.
And everyone's individual needs. Yes,
a general basis.
yes.
Will that be available at some point? Thank you.
Nicole Lee is doing an incredible job and preparing to share that. Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. Representative Demmer.
Julia, it looks like there are more districts on there, if I'm reading this right, and I'm sort of reading from the zero and looking at the number of districts that look like they've added tax capacity compared to the number lost. How does that addition of districts that have added tax capacity, how does that affect the ed fund?
sure, so yes. What you're seeing in this graph is correct, that by a slight margin, there are more districts seeing a relative increase in their state share of weighted pupils than seeing a decrease. And that gets back to, if you think about the various districts, not all districts are going to be the same. They're not all the same size with the same spending levels. So that's why the shift, we can see that there are more districts that are seeing a relative increase to decrease. How that impacts the ed fund, it ultimately depends on what those school districts, school budgets are, what their ed spending number is. And then we will calculate the corresponding tax rates in conjunction with their weighted pupils. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I'm just trying to imagine I'm assuming that all those districts are seeing some tax capacity, they might want to maybe increase their budget a little bit. And how does that sort of filter out amongst the rest of, what we end up having to fund?
So it depends on the size. So
Sure,
if those,
yeah.
like if the 10 districts at the very top
Yeah.
are all only have, 50 students, even if they increase their spending a huge amount in response to the increased tax capacity, it would have very little
Right.
impact on the education fund.
And the same is probably true at the other
Yeah.
end,
Yeah.
unless those are big districts, then,
Mhm.
yeah, right.
And I will also add that how distributed the big districts are across this curve plays into it, right? So they're heavily, if these are all very small or very large, it also plays in conjunction with, well, what does it look like down here and what's happening in the middle?
Interesting graph.
Yeah.
Hate to ask, but I want to make clear to myself, the increase is good and the decrease is bad. Okay,
Equity is good for all of us.
I guess
Like, let's not make value judgments about,
the
but if you
increase,
have less students, you have less.
the increase means that you gained tax capacity this year, which means you can spend more money for the same tax rate or spend the
Yeah.
same amount of money and lower your tax rate.
it's just when it says district share of state LTWADM, thinking, yeah, okay, these had an increased district share of state and it gets confusing.
Yes.
So if I just think of it as tax capacity, it makes it a lot easier. Yes.
And equity is good for everyone across the state because they're all our kids and it's all one ed fund. Thank you for reminding us of that. Other questions about this?
Well, I was just wondering, when you were doing this, it seems logical and simple. That means it was hard to put together properly. What I'm wondering is, was there, what did you see as, I don't know if this will really, how this might play out. What were the biggest things that you had concerns about, or that you even might have concerns about even now?
I think that, I don't mean, this is not meaning to deflect the question, but with respect to concerns, that's really a policy question in terms of what is the goal that the committee, and the General Assembly is trying to achieve.
I guess I didn't mean that. So, I mean, when you put together how to look at this, is there something that you see and think, you know, this step really, it could miss, there could be something wrong with the way this step is put together.
I think that
Yes.
I think that mechanically, this graph is capturing it was relatively simple to put together, because it really is capturing the state share of long-term weighted ADM from one year to the next year. One consideration is that it's capturing all of the changes that a district will see between FY '24. So it's capturing the changes in Act 127. It's also capturing if a district saw demographic shifts. And that's not to say that's the right way or not the right way. It's just, that's how my brain thinks about this chart. That's what it's capturing, is for each district. How big was their slice of the pie?
Thank you.
Any other?
So when you talk about districts changes in demographic, like a demographic change, it seems to me unlikely that like from one year to the next, there would be a dramatic shift. Are you just saying that because it's included and that's a piece of math? Or is there a demographic shift that you've observed that is like kind of fundamentally changing things?
I'd say I'm mostly sharing it because I want to provide all of the information and context when presenting a graph that's simplified. It is true that in smaller districts, the change of one pupil in or out of that district is going to have a relatively larger impact on that district's piece of the pie. So one pupil going into a really large district is not going to have such a relatively big change as one pupil going into a very small district. And
Reminder.
yeah,
And again, I wonder if it's helpful again to like ground us in the context here that the changes in the formula reflect empirically derived numbers about how we won't look back, but if we want to ensure that all kids have access to the constitutionally protected educational outcomes, the funding should reflect these weights. And so it's a small change for some and a big change for some, but we're trying to get to research-based weights. And I mean, I find it reassuring that it's a pretty most schools are within a modest adjustment. There are some of the outliers, and I think that those curves make it pretty easy to maybe know where we need to target our transition mechanism to help adjust to what for some are more significant changes. But I certainly hope that we're not back to debating the underlying intent in any way, and that this is about ensuring all kids have access to what they need to be successful.
And I think we have passed the waiting bill, and we are now grappling with how to best protect those districts as they navigate the transition going forward. And so does anyone have any other thoughts about, again, this is just about how we actually determine that a district has had a reduced tax capacity and needs those kinds of protections.
I just want to add one other thing, which is it's equity, it's equal educational opportunity and equal treatment for Vermont property taxpayers. It's two things happening at the same time. And then the CLA changes are from town to town that property values are taken into consideration. So there's fairness from town to town in this one.
And the waiting bill did not do anything around
No.
CLA whatsoever.
No, but
That is from Act 60, yeah.
Say there's equity in all different aspects of Act 60 and Act 68. And this particular long-term weighted average daily membership fixes something that when the formula started, there were numbers thrown in for some students, not for all students. And the numbers were never based in any kind of reality at all. They were just thrown in. And this is the first time this formula is functioning equally for all kids and taxpayers.
Education Committee. Hello.
Yeah, thank you. Got a question here from Representative Brady.
I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment, if anybody can help at all, but I will say I'm honestly struggling with absolutely the intent. I understand the intent of 127, and I will fully own as a legislator, I don't think I fully understood what I was doing either. And I have, looking at this, if a lot of these dots to the far left are our largest districts, I'm not a math person at all, but to me, there's a fundamental challenge that is going to be insurmountable inside the larger challenge of increased spending and the totality of our education fund and the situation we're in. So I'm a little like, I understand what you're showing us here, though I'd like to see the actual districts on here, because I think this isn't about, not because like, oh, mine versus the other. Of course I'm worried about mine. I'm terrified about mine. But I'm terrified about the whole system right now. And this graph doesn't, I guess, putting this within the context of increased spending, like to me, that bottom left says, so then spending is just going to continue to go because those districts that happen to also be larger, so when we're talking about percentages, then their amounts are going to be so much higher. If they're operating generally at scale, if they've got class sizes that are close to EQS, trim a few places, sure, but you're just never going to trim enough to get anywhere near that.
Representative Brady,
Yeah, sorry.
I think you're jumping a few steps ahead, and I don't think anyone in this room at least has said that it is the larger districts on that end. We have not looked at the distribution of which districts are where yet. I'm just trying to get us to all sort of agree that this is a useful way to measure a loss in tax capacity. And then the transition mechanism and how to protect, and if that will sort of, if the ed fund can sustain that, I think is sort of the next conversation in just a couple slides.
Representative Minier has a question.
This, I hope, is just a straightforward nuts and bolts question. When we're comparing FY25 to FY24, we're looking at FY24 as though the weights had been applied at that time, right?
Sorry, I missed the last part of that.
When we're looking at the FY24 numbers, we're looking as though the weights had been applied in FY24, right? We're not looking at what was in place at that time. We're acting as though these weights had been in place.
Oh, thank you for the clarification. No, here we're looking at FY24 under FY24 current law, which we also refer to as the old weights. And then FY 25 is what the weighted pupil count will be with Act 127 weights or the new weights, what will be under current law in FY 25. So we're looking at the change in the two weighting schemes, because FY 24 was the last year with the old weighting scheme, and FY 25 will be the new year, the first year with the new weighting scheme.
And Julia, can you talk just one more time about how, since that would be comparing apples to oranges, we're using a ratio so we can compare apples to apples?
Exactly.
We talk about fruit so much in this room.
Exactly. So if we were just comparing the pupil count or the weighted pupil count under the old weights in FY 24 to the new weights in FY 25, it would be an apples to oranges comparison, because we have new weights, we have changed weights, we have new student counts, we have new ways of counting kids from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. There's a lot of differences between the two weighting schemes, so we really just can't compare them in terms of the numerical change from one year to the next. What we can compare is the ratio or the state share. So how big was that district's slice of Vermont's total pie of weighted pupils? So that's what this is getting at here, is looking at how big was their slice of Vermont's weighted pupil pie in FY 24 compared to how big was their will their slice be in FY 25?
We got another question here from Representative Buss.
I think it's just a clarifying portion of what you just stated. So if the district last year had 900 long-term weighted ADMs, and because of the new weights, they go up to 1,300, we essentially didn't create any new people, but that's their taxing capacity. So do we have that number across the whole state, or is that what you're saying is apples to oranges, so why even bother?
Exactly. That's sort of an apples to oranges comparison. So if we go back to, I'm gonna switch slides, so I don't want to make anyone nauseous as I scroll, but as we see here, this is essentially what we're talking about doing. Going back to these three example districts, we're seeing a bump in the overall statewide long-term weighted ADM. Every district is seeing an increase in pupil weights, but as you said, it's not like there are 100 new children attending school in the state. There's a new weighting scheme being applied here. So if we were to just look at the difference between the long-term weighted ADM, it would seem as though all districts are gaining tax capacity. But in reality, we know that's not true. So instead, we can look at the relative change in the state share of how big their slice of the pie is. This is really what we're looking at, is how these have shifted.
And because we sort of bizarrely created people that don't actually exist, we've increased 8.3% in actual sort of relative people. 25% minus 16.7, because if we, you know what I mean? Like the difference between the two is how much extra we actually created, right?
So really what the difference is capturing this relative change, it's capturing the relative change by within each district. So we're using a relative change formula. So essentially we're scaling the change in accordance to the size of the district. So I would encourage paying attention to the numbers in the far right column as sort of being their distinct set of, after walking through all of these steps of calculation, here's sort of where we're landing in terms of this is our apples to apples comparison column.
Representative Meadows?
Do we need to first look at ADM itself? Because you could, I think in a sense, have a scenario where the ADM, if it decreases, is actually the real reason why your share goes down, not just the weights, and vice versa. If your ADM goes up, but your weights bring it back down, it could do the exact opposite effect. Was there any thought about looking at ADM first, then looking at how it looks with the weights?
So I won't speak to if there was thought about that. I will speak to, that's true. The graph that we're seeing here is capturing both changes in weights and changes in demographics. So the ADM, so if a district is seeing an increase in kids or a decrease in kids, that's also being picked up here. So that is true, that this graph is picking up weights and kid count. And so if that's the right way to do it is firmly a policy decision.
But if you follow this chart, you have a 5% increase. But you really had a 10% increase in students and your weights negatively affected you. This bill doesn't really get at being able to, or not bill, this example, what we're going through, doesn't get at the real help we want to provide the districts that are mostly affected by the weights, correct? And vice versa, if you had a decline.
So if the intent
Yeah,
is to solely provide a transition mechanism based on weights, then this will be picking up things beyond weights. Yes.
And essentially, because it's not the path to fully isolating changes in number of pupils is not very possible. And so if we're looking at essentially like what happened to a district last year, what's going to happen to a district this year, and how can we sort of protect people from that? This was as close as the math geeks could come.
strictly based on weights, not on age.
Is to do this long-term weighted ADM as the ratio of long-term weighted ADM to the state total of long-term weighted ADM is the closest we could come. And knowing that it might pick up a couple demographic changes, but because it's long-term and not single, that sort of protects from some of that. But it's definitely imperfect.
Okay, yeah,
Representative Taylor, I think you had a hand a while ago, but I don't know if you really had
Yes.
a hand.
I think I'm catching up with Representative Sims. 20 minutes ago. So the goal here is to have this equal. In terms of, it would be nice if the graph were flat.
no, not necessarily.
No, I think we'll always have, because this is essentially looks at, I mean, long-term weighted ADM in the state is essentially picks up the incredible demographic diversity in the state. And so I guess if every town in the state had the exact same demographic diversity compared to each other, which I guess would probably be a nice world, then yes, but unless it did that, then we'll never get there. We're always going to have towns that have more kids who are living in poverty or more kids who are English language learners.
But in this transition period, are we trying to reduce the right and up to left?
We're trying to make sure that the left has a ramp over time to being able to right size their budget.
So, I can see that this works if all we count are the students, their weight, how much resource we have to pour into individual students. But when we calculate a tax rate, we also use the grand list. And what happens to those other things that we use to calculate the grand list? How do they play in?
And that's why the 5% cap doesn't work, because it took all of those things too much into account, I think, in certain ways, and distorted everything. And so I think we have a mechanism that will be more direct to protect those taxpayers who lost tax capacity, that maybe if everyone's sort of on board, if this is the way we're just going to measure and define a loss in tax capacity. Does that work for folks? Yes.
The only thing I wanted to say
Yeah.
is because of what, is happening now. Is there, you said that would be a policy decision to accept this way to look at it, not this chart, but the steps 1, 2, 3, et cetera, coming up to this. Is there another way that to look at this?
I think it depends on, I mean, in short, yes, there are different ways that data can be analyzed to, depending on what the question is that's ultimately being asked. So if the question is, are there other ways to look at this? Yes. And what those ways are, I guess my question back to you and the committees would be, what about this are you trying to step away from?
It seems to make sense to me. It seems to be very fair in the way it's applied. And that's what, a little bit of what I was trying to get at before. If you could look at this and see anything with this entire analysis we've heard the whole time this afternoon and say, that is a sticking point with this analysis versus a different tax policy analysis.
Again, this is not necessarily tax policy analysis.
Well,
This
she was
is
saying it
just-
can't be
yes.
policy, so
Yeah,
I'm trying to get at the numbers.
I would
I want
say
to
this
be
is-
sure I
yeah.
get it. I don't want to have another cap situation, so I want to just be sure.
Sure. So I think that, another way would be to, look at the share of the state's, a district's share of the state long-term weighted ADM when calculated under the same weighting schemes in the same year. In order to try to parse out solely the weighting change, I think, which gets back to your question. One challenge with that gets to the way that data is collected in FY 24 and FY 25. So you'll recall that in Act 127, there's a new way of measuring students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. So the old weighting scheme used free and reduced price lunch. The new weighting scheme uses that and universal income declaration form and Medicaid certification data. So that economically disadvantaged metric would need to be disaggregated for the economically disadvantaged weight to be applied. So that would be one option.
And so that's like, I'd say that's an example of where we'd wind up attempting to compare apples to apples and we would fail. Because we're never gonna be able to perfectly disaggregate that. And so we're gonna attempt to be apples to apples. We're gonna wind up with apples to crab apples and quinces. I'm looking for something close. Good apple. Yeah, a cousin of an apple. Pears, thank you. And so better to move to this ratio, which is more about the experience of those districts with regards to capacity than the exact counts in those districts, because we can't exactly compare the count. And since this whole thing is about how individual districts have a relationship with their taxes and their spending to the full capacity of the state, I feel like that's the part that we're strengthening in Act 127 and the part that we have lost a little bit of track of in this year's budget environment. This even mathematically sort of strengthens reminds us that that's what we're always thinking about, that every district spending and every district's tax capacity only exists in relationship to the whole.
Okay.
Okay.
Then I have a follow-up then.
Okay, and then we need to
All
really,
right.
okay.
Because so you mentioned universal, the new universal meals form and the free and reduced lunch and the Medicaid data. Are those only things that are, that would be impacted if you went to what you're talking about?
I would need to go back and think through it in more detail, before I could comfortably say one way or another.
So the reason I'm asking these things is to see, will districts then who have a greater number of children who are Medicaid or a Medicaid reimbursement, free and reduced lunch, will their children be less able to have access to tax capacity than another districts?
Well, I think that's the purpose of the ratio, is that it's like we're sort of growing the number of economically disadvantaged students that we're counting this year across the board. And we're doing that because we all acknowledge 127, that the way we were doing it before was not a very accurate count, and likely disadvantaged districts with English language learners who might be on, like districts where folks might not feel comfortable going to the economic services office to ask for help, whether that was because of rurality and being far away from a district, or say Representative Brownigan's district where people might have a lower trust in government services. Or you brought that up yourself, I'm not taking your district. Or versus say my district where, you know, a lot of people are within walking distance of the food stamp office, so might be more likely to sign up.
Okay.
And so we were moving to a much more accurate way of doing this, of measuring. And so want to make sure that we're sort of retaining that accurate way of measuring and knowing that that grows the whole pot for everyone. And so if we're growing the whole pot, then it's again, people's relationship to the pot that matters, not the actual size of their ladle of soup. Really sticking with that metaphor there for the soup and the pot. Okay.
All right. Thank you
So-
very much for letting me ask
Absolutely.
many questions.
Many questions. We love many questions. Education Committee, I would love to move to what we're actually going to do with this data point now that we have it. You all ready for that? Okay. So we needed a more linear transition mechanism. We all agreed on that last time. The percentage cap doesn't work because of all the distorting influences. We've used a cent discount before. I mean, a cent could then become cents, CS, right? It could even become $1 if you have 100 of them, right? So moving to a discount, it's like only Tuesday and I'm getting ridiculous. So finding a way that we can sort of retain that linear relationship and protect taxpayers, the mechanism of sort of doing this discounting seemed like the most obvious choice. And so we asked the data nerds to essentially think about various ways we could apply a cent discount to this arc. When we look across it, so I was hoping when we saw this, that there would be like really clear inflection points so we could do a stepped system, right? Could do quintiles or something. But this is actually like a pretty smooth, pretty curve. And so a smoother mechanism made the most sense. Like the data says, we want a smooth mechanism, not a stepped mechanism, right? Does that make sense to everyone?
No cliffs.
Okay, no cliffs, because it's clearly something that doesn't have cliffs built into it. So going from there, have asked Julia to sort of model something out that is a cent discount per percentage loss. So this here is a model of the percentage loss in tax capacity, essentially the percentage share. For every percent, we'd have a cent. Can you share that with us?
Sure.
Thanks.
So in follow-up to that lead-in, this is illustrative structure of a transition mechanism. Again, I'm always noting this. Again, I note that these are illustrative. It's things I've been asked to present, not to be interpreted as policy recommendation from me, nor from the Joint Fiscal Office. So the general structure of the transition mechanism is that districts would receive a penny discount on the equalized homestead tax rate equal to the decrease of their share of the state pupils from FY 2024 to FY 2025, rounded to the nearest whole cent. So lots of words. What does that mean? We think back to that S graph that we were just looking at and where each one of those districts fell was really showing what their relative change was between those two fiscal years. So essentially, that would mean that if you had a district whose share relatively decreased by 12.1%, then that district would receive a 12-cent discount on its homestead equalized tax rate. A district whose share relatively decreased by 0.4% would not receive a discount because that's rounded to zero. A district whose share relatively increased would not receive a discount on its homestead equalized tax rate. So that's the general structure.
And I just want to sort of remind folks that one of the problems with the 5% was that districts were sort of getting pushed into it because other districts were pushed into it. This wouldn't happen here. And so the districts that are gaining tax capacity wouldn't be in the same difficult position that they were in under both the December 1st modeling and afterwards.
Repeat that.
No,
Oh.
I just because I have no idea what I said, not because I refused to.
The districts.
I don't know.
The districts who are.
Let's just pretend I didn't say it.
All right, okay.
Yes, Representative. I hope it's not about what I said.
No, it's not,
Okay.
it's not. So would that discount start at 1% in change?
So that's a policy decision.
Sure, all right, just one.
The way that I've been asked to present it here today is that, if that change rounded, I guess it's rounded to the closest percentage is -1% from FY 24 to FY 25, then it would be a 1-cent discount.
So that's why you had the 0.4 there.
So if someone had minus 0.6,
Right,
it
then
would
that'd
be
be
1
1%,
cent.
right.
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah.
Good.
Um,
Does everyone remember how to
Thank
round?
you.
Yeah.
Okay, Representative Sims has a question. Or thought.
I think what I heard you talking about was that this is a slightly more like linear relationship where the change in pupils and your school budget and your tax rate of discount are directly connected together. And that's part of, I think, what we learned was not so effective about the 5% cap, that it's still everyone sort of mixing together, and that this helps soften the transition, but in a much more direct linear way than our previous system. So.
Yes, thank you. I hope that's what I said. It was well said, whatever you said. Okay.
one other piece that I'll point out that, this is different than the cap is the cap included spending decisions. This is really just looking at the change in capacity.
Is this contemplated for 1 year or 5 years or?
I think we'll get there in a second. Great question.
Obviously a policy decision. Policy.
Because we already sort of promised 5 years, I asked Julia to model everything as 5 years, but it would be, I think one of them. We sort of said 5 years and find your own way through those 5 years. And I've asked Julia to sort of describe for us a 5-year stepped down mechanism so that people don't need to, so districts don't need to find their own way through. Will we step down on its own?
I think this is where it kind of gets at my point about EDM, like District C there could, that 16.7% relative change could all be because their ADM went down, not the weights.
Correct.
So we could artificially 17-cent discount to a district that had a decrease in enrollment, not the weights that factored into that.
That's correct.
That's a worry. I don't, without looking at all the districts, I have no idea if that's even an issue, but that's a worry.
If you have a way to fix it, please, like really do think about it.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Representative Anthony.
Just, I share that possible confusion, but because the values, at least the number of bodies in there are averages, a dramatic change wouldn't sway it dramatically in just one fiscal year to another, one school year to another. And secondly, it's awful hard to separate demographics, as we customarily use the term, and the weights, because the weights reflect how many people are in high school or how many people are in elementary school. So literally the number of folks and where they are in education is itself a weight, not a body count, so to say.
And we can talk to Nicole some more when and if she's sitting there in the witness chair about what the nature of the L in the long-term weighted, the long-term as part of the long-term weighted ADM and how that's counted. Yes, Representative.
Thank you. So for what Chris was saying, I'm just, I'm wondering if when we look at demographics in the state and we see that student population is dropping off, then I'm wondering how that plays into what we're looking at. And I'm also wondering, I lost it.
We can come back to you if you can.
Oh, this is what I'm wondering. I'm wondering if we play this out 5 years with a 5-year ramp, safety ramp, whatever we called it, then I'm wondering if that's going to be an issue, because depending on how that demographic thing works out.
Let's wait to get to the 5 years, because the 5 years is actually predicated, it's just all a build up from that first year. So it's not that we're not recalculating every year for 5 years, which I think would further confuse the matter.
Okay.
So I just want to, before we get into the transition across 5 years, let's see, like, do we understand this? Do we have further questions about just this general structure?
Yes.
Okay.
First of all, wouldn't the total number of children you have, students you have, no matter what the number is, wouldn't that just be 100%? And then we could start comparing town to town or shifting their weighted amount that they have where the district places on that blue graph. That's based on a percentage of students.
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
Well, Carol was saying, are we gonna be in a pickle when the number of students goes down? It changes,
Oh, and so that would still, since we're looking at relation to the whole, if the whole pie shrinks, then the relative relationship to the pie stays the same. If the relationship to the pie stays the same. So that shouldn't matter if the whole pie shrinks or grows. That's why we used it, because the whole pie grew. And so if the whole pie shrinks, the ratio could still stay the same. And that's why we're using a ratio. I'm gonna ask you to go on to the next slide unless, okay.
So this is the final slide that I had prepared. I guess I could have included more about the 5 year. But essentially the thought is that taking a district's discount that's calculated in year one, so for FY25, and then decreasing that district by a uniform fifth each year. So if in FY25 a district saw a decrease in its tax capacity of 10%, it would get 10 cents. In the following year, it would get 8 cents. The following year, it would get 6, 4, 2, and then phasing out to 0 in FY 2030. So a uniform, so basically for each district, it's calculating a uniform step down of 1/5 through the 5 fiscal years.
So I think, for me, I think the next way to sort of get our heads around this is to look at the legislative language. But before we go to that, we can spend another minute on this slide or the slide before it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm wondering why you have in here the homestead or non-homestead rate would need to be adjusted without talking about any other revenue sources being adjusted. Like if you took more of the.
Because Julia always models
Meals
everything
and-
with all else being equal, because that's her job.
Okay, that's good, thank you. And then the second thing is, you say what the cost is in the first, in fiscal year 25. And it's just a simple math where it goes down or how do you know what it is in the out year?
So I built in this transition mechanism into the yield model that I use to run different scenarios, and calculate the yields. And essentially you can determine the cost by seeing by solving the yield model before there's any transition mechanism and seeing what the rates and yields would be. And then modeling in the transition mechanism and seeing essentially how much is the ed fund short, how much additional revenue needs to be raised in order to cover the transition mechanism. So that's what this $30 million refers to. It is when all else is equal.
And let's say that because of this, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, it's okay.
Let's say because of this new transition mechanism, districts want to make other decisions about their budgets. The cost would change because all else wouldn't be equal. Julia's modeling this based on the newest information we have from the Agency of Education about how budgets are being warned. And we can look at an outlook related to this after we look at the legislative language.
And then the would be that it would be a decreasing amount for every year for the next several years.
Can you give us an example of that?
In terms of the
20%. Oh, do you mean the decreasing amount of 30 million? I'm sorry. Oh,
yes, living in the world of all else equal.
Sorry.
Representative Beck.
So right now, the way I understand this is that a district gets a discount on their equalized rate. Was there any conversation about putting it on the adjusted instead?
No, there wasn't.
Because the equalized gets, it becomes more than 10 cents once the CLA is applied, it becomes much bigger number. Why wouldn't we just put it on their adjusted?
I think there's two considerations with that. One is the cap was applied to the equalized rate. And two, by applying it to the equalized rate, as you know, it's before the CLA. So the way that discount factor is felt across different districts will be the same based on where they fall on that curve. It will be proportional. Whereas if it were after the application of the CLA, it would be,
I'm just thinking like if a district has just reappraised, and they're sitting on 100, they're gonna get a 10-cent discount.
It's very unusual though for a district and a reappraisal cluster to be the same thing.
Yeah, I know, but if you're at 100, your homes are gonna be worth more because you just reappraised. You're gonna get a 10-cent discount. Just trying to think this through. And then if you haven't reappraised for a while, let's say you're at 70% CLA, that 10 cents is going to create a bigger discount on a house that's appraised for less value. And I'm just trying to figure out if that disadvantages one group, over another versus.
I think that's a good question. I guess I wonder, we've just always done all of this at the district level. I think because of that, like the tax rate, it's sort of decided at the district level, right? Like the decisions about school spending are happening at the district level and they're not happening at the town level. So applying the discount at the town level seems
That's true.
wild to me.
Yeah. Okay, all right.
Mr. Messer.
Yeah, just to back up, towards the beginning. Your graph with the blue dots. I wondered why you chose, a percentage of the pie as a lens to go through, get that. Now, right, now I see that the proposed mechanism, any discount, works in tandem with that. So now I see why you propose to do that and it makes sense. Thank you. I was wondering, but now, get all, here we are. Thank you.
I don't think it was, I love that you found that to be like delightfully synergistic. I think we're actually just figuring out how to measure a loss in tax capacity and then,
Understood.
yeah, and then the percent of a sense,
Those two
it's a
are,
very nice alignment, yeah.
oh, thank you.
Yeah.
We may have a couple of questions here.
Our team working on this. We're gonna go to the education committee.
So I was looking at the $30 million number, and it might be worth mentioning that in the lead up to 127, we did try to calculate what the cost was going to be to the ed fund for those districts who we thought at that time would be using the 5% cap because they were the most affected by it. And so I think that number was about 17 million back in 2019 or 2020. So just to sort of put that in, just in comparison with the 30 million, that it's I would call it well within the ballpark of what we were talking about, and in fact, a little bit more contributing to making that transition a little less challenging. Is that, Emily, in your recollection, is that accurate to say?
Yeah, it is. And I think it's also, this is significantly, I think this is in keeping with the original intent of the legislation, and I think is going to work better than what is in current law. So I see this as the number sort of as a nice spot in the middle.
Representative Stone has a question.
Yes. I know that you probably already answered this, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around how the discount or capacity lost is going to be calculated. What are the two numbers that districts should use to be figuring out what their discount is? Can you just clarify that one more time? Sorry.
Before you clarify, I just want to offer that Nicole Lee at the Agency of Education is going to be calculating that and sharing ways to calculate it with districts. And so districts don't need to figure out how to calculate it based on this conversation we're having here right now. More transparent and clear information will be given to them. But back to you, Julia.
Representative Austin. I'm sorry, Julie, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I will defer to Nicole for the details, but essentially it's the FY24 long-term weighted ADM without some of the more weedy factors like hold harmless and
Phantom pupils
to the FY25 long-term weighted ADM. But Nicole is really the one who can speak about the nuances of those counts.
Representative Austin has a question.
I don't know if it's possible to do this at this point, but when all else is equal, can you estimate what the cost will be to the ed fund over each year for the next 5 years?
We can only estimate what the cost would be in FY 2025, holding all else equal, because we don't model out future years of the ed fund because it really is built on school district budgets. So as we saw this year, we're seeing different things in flux in the ed fund. So I can only provide an all else equal estimate for FY 25.
Okay, thank you.
And
But it'll
Representative-
go down 20% each year.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Minio has a question.
This is another, I think, kind of nuts and bolts definitional question. I was wondering if how poverty was defined changed from FY24 to FY25. Did it go from an estimate to Medicaid information, and how might that have affected, is that what caused this sort of discovery of poverty, if you will, or more poverty than we expected?
Yeah, so Act 127 changed the way that students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds were counted. More were counted this year in part, and I don't know how much in part, because of the new ways of counting poverty. So that's the free and reduced price lunch, direct certification in Medicaid, universal income declaration form. I don't know if AOE can speak to that in more detail. And those changes in both the way that students from economically disadvantaged background are counted and or potentially a bigger push to count those students is why we're seeing increases in those students this year. And there's a higher weight for those students in Act 127.
I do think we also have more students living in poverty this year than we did last year overall in this.
Yeah,
Like
that's
that's
what-
what census data also says, but most, from what other conversations we've had, it seems like most of the effect is actually just a better way of measuring.
And I guess I was also just curious if that correlated in any way with, urban versus rural, or if that sort of analysis has been done. Was more poverty found in one place than another?
We did that analysis when we were working on 127, and that's why we changed the way that we measure poverty, because there was a bias in the poverty measurement against rural areas. And that's something that we talked about also a lot in the context of school meals, and it might be, if you all want to dive deeper into that, I think folks from Hunger Free could probably rehash that testimony for you.
Thanks.
Representative Stone has a question.
Sorry, going back to the discount capacity loss. I know a lot of our superintendents right now are probably asking this question. When can we expect to get that information? Because I know that they're like trying to plan for their budgets and stuff. Is there a timeline?
So we,
Get that information through us.
the timeline in my head is we're going to look at the legislative language. And then if the legislative language is to folks' liking, we would look at what the possible impact would be on districts with the Agency of Education who's ready with that information for us. And then we would need to pass the legislative language out of committee and it would need to go to the floor. And I know you know these things, I'm just sort of saying it for the public at this point. It would need to go to the floor. We would pass it on, we would pass it out of the House. It would go to the Senate. They're certainly clued into the conversations we're having, but certainly things could change on the journey as they do. And then it would need to go to the governor's desk. The administration is also quite prepped with these, conversations as we're having them because they're also concerned about property tax rates this year. And so it would, certainly take a few weeks at the minimum for this to become law. And at that point, the final law-related data would become clear from the Agency of Education. But I feel nervous about districts recalculating their entire budgets based on a conversation we're having right here in committee, given how much could change between now and when a bill passes. Though I know everyone's doing it.
So clear on a process, but not so much a timeline is what I'm hearing from that.
Preliminary information is going to be available in committee today, but that's not the law. And I don't think anyone in this entire building can predict how long it takes for legislation to become law. We're going
Thank
to
you.
go as fast as we can while doing good work. Education Committee, do you all have anything else before we go to thoughts and questions over here?
No, thank you.
I
Oh, I'm sorry, one more.
Just one more question, and it might be not easy to answer, but I'm just wondering how you're thinking or how we're going to measure that this action that we're taking is really going to increase learning for students in poverty, ELL students.
So I think the answer to that is the current conversation is about what's to take place between now and school budget votes.
Yeah,
That bigger question is a good one, but to hold.
okay.
But mostly it's your committee's responsibility to figure that out. And I thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, Representative Andrews?
Julia, can I assume that the $30 million estimate that you have on your slide is just about the cost of that discount of taxes, or are there other items that are in the legislative language yet to be seen that is included in that number?
That's solely based on the transition mechanism that I presented today and everything else that we're assuming in the ed fund. Like assuming that all school district budgets remain the same last week and everything else, it's the cost of the transition mechanism.
What would the graph look like after this is applied? Is that a valid question?
So this graph?
Yeah.
So this graph is really just trying to measure the change in share from FY '24 to FY '25. So no matter what the transition mechanism will or won't be, if there's anything, this graph won't change because this is
Because it's
solely comparing state share in FY '24 of long-term weighted ADM against state share or district share, sorry, in FY '25.
Yeah. Okay.
And just
Representative Brannigan, yeah.
to clarify, Madam Chair, make sure I have this right. So it's the state share. And when we talk about the reason that one point is in a block and another point is in a different block has to do with the student needs in that district, right?
So, not necessarily. The way these districts have been plotted is really looking at the change in the size of that pie slice for districts. So the district share of long-term weighted ADM in FY '24 to the share in long-term weighted ADM in FY '25. And that could be probably in large part is attributed to the change in weights. Also demographic shifts. And so it solely is picking up the share, not making a value judgment about which districts need more or less.
How would we do that?
Sorry?
Why would we do that? Why would we measure the change and not the point where the students are at?
I
understand your question.
Why are we using the change from one year to the next as the data to place the dot in the graph? And why aren't we using the weight of the students? The weight of the students is based on the amount of resources it takes to educate them.
Yeah, that's what we are. It's the weight of the students relative to all, that's what the W and
That's not what
LPW.
Julia said. She said it was change.
So I think that to clarify, we're looking at the change in long-term weighted average daily membership. So yes, the weights are included here. What this is trying to capture is how a district's tax capacity is changing from year to year. This is solely to inform the policy discussion about the transition mechanism. This is not speaking to weighting schemes in one way or another.
I'll just sit here and hope that I get it by the end of the day. I know we have a ways to go.
Well, I think looking at the legislative language is actually a really good next step because I think we all process information differently. And so let's move to the legislative language. Representative Odie, we're just going to move to legislative. Representative Mattos.
I just have one question about the mechanism here. So I'm hearing a lot about districts where they hit that 5% cap and then do a calculation to stay underneath the 10% increase in spending, and you have a block of money there. Say it's $10 million. So this would then scale that money over 5-year period to help pay that down over 5 years, right? So if you have a tax rate that would have been, say, an increase of 20 cents, because you spent all the way just right below that 10% increase in spending, but you had that 5% cap. So you had say a 20 cent increase. And this gave you insulation for the next 5 years. Is that kind of how we're just spreading out that 5% cap in a sense?
No, we're getting rid of the 5% cap. 5% cap is over.
Okay. I never saw that on.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, yeah.
That's because that was my preamble, but you were 5 minutes late to committee.
I was listening the whole way on YouTube in my earbuds. Right here when I was listening.
You're right, that is not on the slide deck. Yes, we would remove the 5% cap and change to the cent discount instead.
So even with that, say the 5%'s gone, district spends the same amount of money. And now you have a discount on your tax rate, which is effectively almost a cap because it's being spread out over 5 years.
But they're now paying the homestead tax rate on the entire amount of spending, not just the portion that's 5% cap.
But we're still adding capacity to those budgets, or in a sense.
Depends on how much they bring to the cap.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Because just speaking, like Milton, right in their budget presentation, we have a great slide that says we could have spent $2.13 million more and still had the same tax rate. And then there's a little caveat. We didn't, and I'll commend them. They did not take advantage of that capacity. And there are other districts that I'm hearing that took advantage of that capacity. You know, it's there on the table. But now with this discounted tax rate over the next 5 years, that could effectively just spread that increase over 5 years because you're insulating the actual tax impact.
So, well, one, there were districts who did not have a reduction in their tax capacity, who are hitting the 5% and making spending decisions based on that 5%, who will not receive any insulation after this. But I think more importantly, and we'll sort of get to this after the legislative language, likely after districts learn about this new system, after we pass this, they are going to want to make different budgeting decisions than they've made right now. Some districts might want to, it's possible that a couple districts would want to spend a little bit more. Likely some districts are going to want to spend less because they were sort of in that right under the 10%. And we also, I'm having other language drafted to allow districts to move their budget votes out a little bit to give them time to redraft their budgets and rewarn their budgets. And so that we'll look at that legislative language tomorrow. So that districts might lower their spending. And I think that's another way we can change the yield this year. That won't be sort of in the model we're looking at from Julia. Yeah,
And let's not forget the cap is, I mean, it was not 1 year protection, it's a 5-year protection, so. I mean, so it wasn't. I mean, we didn't do anything, they had the same protection that. Yeah.
Okay, let's just look at the language and we can have the exact same conversation once the language is up, but Julia doesn't have to sit in that chair anymore.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Julia, for all your work. Kirby, would you like to join us? Or will you join us, whether you'd like to?
All right, it's time for the word learners to have some time. Kirby Keaton, Legislative Council. So I've prepared some draft language based off of what Julia just explained. The first thing that we do here in the first section is repeal Section 7 of Act 127. So that would be the tax rate caps and tax rate review. And next, is this a good size for everyone, by the way? Next, we get into the replacement transition mechanism that we've been talking about. And what's on screen now is put into words how to calculate the impact of the pupil weighting and the demographic changes that Julia was talking about for each district in figuring out the state share. So the beginning of the graph with the blue dots, right? So first, the Secretary of Education would calculate the long-term weighted average daily membership for fiscal year 2024 using the funding formula in effect now, right, for fiscal year 24. And then calculate the district's percentage share of total long-term weighted average daily membership for 2024 when divided by the total long-term weighted average daily membership for all districts. And then those two steps repeat themselves for 2025, except based off of actual 27's pupil weighting. So this is just put into words what Julia did with math. And then it comes together to make that the chart with the blue dots in B here, where it says, for each school district, the secretary shall calculate the relative percent decrease or increase starting from the percentage determined under subdivision 2 of this section and compared to the percentage determined under subdivision A4. So that tells us the relative percent decrease or increase for any given school district. That is how you identify each of those dots on the chart.
Can you repeat that? Would you mind repeating that? Just the same thing?
Sure. It's so far we've calculated the for each district how it compares to the entire state for how its weighted daily membership has changed, as in how its pupil counts have changed for 2024 and for 2025. And then by comparing those two together, the Agency of Education will determine the relative percent decrease or increase compared with the rest of the state, right? Which is the blue dots we saw. Am I helping clarify?
Might be having an aha moment.
Okay.
Actually beginning,
Yeah.
I'm getting there.
The words, they help some people.
Right. So that's really what these first two subsections of this are. We're at the blue dot chart part of Julia's presentation, where it's just the math to get to ultimately an attempt at figuring out what was your relative increase or decrease compared with the rest of the state for how your per pupil counts are weighted or treated. But also what's built into that is the demographic changes. If you have students come and go, that's also built into that, as Julia pointed out. So once that's.
We have thought.
I'm sorry, it's just like going back to Julia's chart and it's like the change in district share of the state long-term weighted blah, 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 blah. That's what the change is. As I understand.
For each dot, for each dot, it's a decrease if it compared with the rest of the state, they have less share. And the dot's an increase if they have more share when compared to the rest of the state, right? So after we've determined that.
Yeah, sorry.
I was just gonna add to what Kirby was saying, that we're talking about the left-hand side from 0.6 loss on down the left-hand side of the chart.
And my struggle is I understand that. And I understand how it works to make the chart what it looks like. I don't understand why that is valuable to us when we compare it to where each child is actually functioning for this year. I don't understand why where the children are, where the students are at, why that's not the most important thing.
What do you mean the students are at? What does that mean?
Say you have a deaf child. How much can he hear? Can he read lips, or where is he in his ability to communicate?
So a child with any kind of learning or processing disability would be under a totally different set of education financing.
Well, okay,
So-
then how about a math problem, a child who's slow in getting math, like what I just said to Kirby. Kirby, I need you to say that, or whatever it is. But you need it over again. You know, he needs it twice in class. He can't get it the first time. So that child should weigh more.
That's not how the weights work.
But I mean, I think maybe underlying your question is this, important assumption that it takes different resources to achieve the same outcomes for kids. And that's the kind of equity piece that's built into the changes in the weights. So that's the work that we did in Act 127, to say, let's adjust the taxing capacity based on what we know about rurality, high poverty, high population of English language learners. And so we fixed the formula to make it do a better job at allowing for taxing capacity to access resources to achieve those educational outcomes. So we fixed that. The problem is we're asking people to go from situation A to situation B overnight. And for some people, you know, most of the schools, it's a modest adjustment, but on either ends of the spectrum, we're asking people to have operated under a formula where they had X amount of kids and X taxing capacity to radically shrink that, or in some cases grow it. And we're just trying to soften that radical, you know, without any mechanism. People might have to either constrict their budgets a tremendous amount because they've lost the number of pupils, or have huge tax increases.
What I don't understand is why it's just the change we're including here, and we're not including those differences in instruction.
I guess what I want to offer is.
Two different reasons.
So I want to offer, so this conversation we're having here today is about the reduction in tax capacity for students and how, reduction in tax capacity for districts and how we want to mitigate those changes. We need to have at least two more significant conversations this session. The second one is, given what tax rates will likely look like, even after we make these changes, though I do believe these changes will make a big difference, what to do about that. And that might be adjustments to how we adjust for income, all of those things, what more revenue going to the ed fund might look like or might not look like, bunch of things. That's step two that we can do after we restore a linear relationship to the education fund. And then step three, which also probably needs to happen this session, and we would do in deep collaboration with House Education, is what do we need to do in Vermont regarding making sure that our education system is effective as possible and our education supports that effective education. And so that's making sure, you know, that's to Sarita's question that she asked earlier about making sure that what we're doing is effective. That's making sure that school construction is taken care of outside of maybe education spending, all of that. But right now, we're just looking at reduction in tax capacity. And what I'd like to do, because this is a lot of content, is to have Kirby finish just taking us through this language, and then we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back. So we're going to go through the language. It's really short. There's just like a little bit more words.
So for the rest of the language, subsection C here, it gives the 1% decrease for every 1% relative decrease using the formula. So the tax rate change for the districts would be for every only for the districts that had a relative decrease when compared to the state, right? They would receive 1 cent for every 1% that it decreased. And that's for 2025. And then we have below that subdivisions 1 through 4, which are a phase out. So in 2026, the district would receive 80% of the decrease that it received in 2025, and then 60, then 40, then 20 over 5 years until it phases out. And then there's just a few more provisions, which are just to make sure that it's understood. There's a provision here on sub D that says that there's a $1 floor for a tax rate. That if you had a lot of relative decrease under the calculations above, that couldn't have such a tax rate decrease under this act that would bring you under $1. Which without that, it could be possible. So we're making sure that doesn't happen. And in sub E here, we have a clarification that these tax rate decreases will apply to income sensitized properties. Because there was some confusion in Act 127 about that when it came to the caps. And then sub F here, make sure that it's clear that districts with a relative increase do not receive a benefit, even though the math part should make that clear. I included that just to avoid confusion. And so that's what we have.
Clarifying questions about the language.
About the language. Okay,
Indeed.
so how will that decrease for the income payer be? And obviously, we can't give them a 10-cent decrease because they pay on a percent of household income. So how will that math work?
Julia?
Sure. I think that that's an outstanding question.
Because we did it during Act 46. I just don't remember how we did it.
Okay. Okay, we'll figure that out.
Okay.
I can learn more.
Other questions about the language?
It should just be the wrong time to ask about the language that isn't in there.
Yeah.
About excess spending threshold.
Yes.
Okay.
Any clarifying questions about this language? On the screen. Yes, you're welcome to ask questions about it. I just really want to keep us.
Use of the term equalized homestead property tax rate. Is that really the best way to identify that? Because it's confusing, I think, too. Or I want to make sure it's clear what exactly that is. Is that post CLA, pre-CLA?
It's post, it's the homestead rate for that portion.
It's post.
So it's pre, then it's pre, because if it's for the district.
We need to be very clear on that, because that's
Thank
screwed
you.
up a lot of
Sorry.
things.
Because, yeah, the CLA would adjust it by the municipality.
So is there something that isn't there another word for that? The equalized adjusted district rate or something like that? Because that confuses people. Confused. Because that's what it says at the top of your tax bill. It says homestead property tax rate after CLA's been applied. There's no better term.
Isn't that the technical term?
There's no technical definition in law. It says that, no, that I've been able to find.
There's a definition in the law, but it mostly references other definitions. It does require an understanding of all the pieces.
Yeah, but nowhere in the law is there a quote that says equalized homestead property tax rate means this. There's ways, it tells you how to calculate it, but it doesn't say this is what it is. Isn't there some other term that we use for that with pre-CLA?
Equalized, I think is what we always use.
Okay.
Yeah.
An equalized homestead property tax rate.
Before CLA.
I just wish it were clearer.
I think one of the things that's become very clear to everyone through this process is that our education funding formula has a lot of remarkable definitions in it and terms. And, I think we talked last week about sort of this tension between equity and simplicity and local control and how hard those all are.
That's why I'd like to make sure we're very clear
Yeah.
on what these things mean.
And I've been absolutely blown away by how quickly Nicole Lee has picked up all of these wild terms in the course of month or two she's been doing this job. And so I have some faith. Most people don't read statute. Most people read explanations of statute from administrative agencies. And so I have a lot of faith in how that's going to be communicated by the administration in this context, and think that that's something that we can actually talk about very directly very soon, once we get clear on making sure that the statutory language would be interpreted the same way by multiple people in the administration whose job it is to interpret statute. But I feel like statute should be clear to people who read statute, not necessarily clear to the public, though I would love if that's the way the world worked. I don't think we can do both. Okay. I think with that, we're gonna take a break. It's gonna be great. And we're gonna be back at